All right, so we're going to jump into our third chat. This one was going to be about energy in the real framework, the E in real. And I think one of the I'll pull up the slide here in a second, but really when I think about energy, I think about like the ability to unleash like the full capacity of your being, like your mind, your body, your spirit, and sort of the ways that that ripples out in your life. And when you think about energy, just big picture as part of the framework, like what comes alive for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on sort of the field or tradition maybe you're looking at, but if you were to take something like traditional positive psychology or, the study of let's say well-being or life satisfaction, words like vitality come to mind. So, um, physical capacities to live, I think, in ways that are aligned with values or desires or goals or those sorts of things. Of course, it's not a prerequisite for happiness. There's plenty of people that live satisfying lives across, let's say, the ability spectrum, if you want to put it that way. But just the energy, the capacity, the not so much a ability, but the volition in some cases, maybe the inspiration and the motivation to do certain things as well. So that's where it maybe transfers out of, let's say, just the traditionally physical and a little bit more into the psychological or the emotional, if you will. Those are the different ways I tend to think about it, kind of a combination of, the psychic and the physiological.
Yeah. You didn't say vitality just to appeal to Vitality Labs. I love that word. Um,
Yeah.
I, one of the things I hear from employers a lot is as younger people are coming into the workforce, this is an area that is really under indexed. You've got young people, combination of just how they show up ready to work, right? Are they present? Are they engaged? Are they fully there? Are they bringing their best energy? The other dimension of it really is, what they describe in terms of the mental health and sort of the downstream ramifications of sleep and eating and some of the basics that I think are building blocks of good energy that I don't think, a lot of us learned about until later in life. And certainly this generation is not picking up in school. And so part of the real framework is and focus on energy is really in the feedback that we're getting from employers. And so, I thought one of the things we just start with when you're coaching executives, let's say, and as we're applying it to younger people, I imagine physical wellness routine comes up a lot. And I know your colleague Adam, focuses a lot on physiology, but in terms of wellness routines, in terms of physical wellness, what are some best practices or behaviors that you've kind of recommended to clients, even the college athletes? Let's talk about that you work with, right? What comes up in the wellness routine category?
Yeah. So the college athletes is interesting, but it's also, I think, an entry point into probably arguably the single most important thing kind of on this list or that we might file under energy. So the college athlete, as you might imagine, and as you well know, generally we're not giving any sort of advice, let's say on nutrition, fitness routine, exercise, because that's what they're there for, and they're working with generally world-class specialists on that, right?
Yeah.
However, what we are generally working with them on because of the time scarcity of a high level athlete is getting more and or better sleep. So it's a good place to start because if you're talking about, let's say, high burnout professionals, like the kind of like high impact, high performance adults that we work with, or youth athletes, or just students, higher education or secondary, that simply have a lot of demands, goals, pressures, whatever it might be, more often than not, you're going to be seeing sleep issues, either by just a consequence of the environment or maybe bad sleep habits because of certain things to kind of cope with the stress, or just because they've gotten into bad habits like a lot of us do. So sleep, I would say, is always a starting point that's going to underpin emotion regulation. It's going to underpin actual physical vitality. It's going to underpin motivation, just all sorts of things, right? So that's got to be kind of a cornerstone.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of the thing that I think about with this generation, the technologies that they're coming up with and sort of the ways that they interact with those technologies, I don't think we're given great education around the impacts of the technology in a couple different dimensions, right? Like, so we've got blue light exposure, we've got what is it like in overindulgence in dopamine without even knowing it, different factors there. I don't know if there's anything you can speak into in that dimension that would help, that we can start exploring as we go.
Yeah, I mean, so like is the case with many things like the phone conversation and say mental health or energy or those sorts of things has I'd say been divided into sort of extreme camps. I
Mm.
tend to find neither of those super appealing, and although I understand kind of the legitimacy, I think a lot of the debate and the research, as I understand it, and a lot of the nuance falls around whether or not you can actually claim causality, or in this case, let's say the smart technology as the mechanism.
Mhm.
But let's if we set that aside for a second and just say like there's different debates, there's different nuance, and speak to exactly what you're talking about. Like put it very simply. If we're talking energy, I'm going to oversimplify here,
Yeah.
but you could sort of separate, let's say, physical or bodily energy. Like you might feel physically exhausted, let's say, after a baseball game, or I might feel that after a soccer game. Certainly, that's very different than what we might say the cognitive load, or in some cases, cognitive energy of finishing a 2 hour final exam, right? Those things might be experienced a little differently. When it comes to relationship with technology, like that might not be physically taxing in the same. I mean, we can make arguments, right? Like
Right.
there's interesting stuff around, if you're standing up holding a phone and you're looking straight down at it, that's putting pressure on your neck. That's creating potential back issues, all sorts of things, right? But that's not necessarily what we're getting into here. What people have to appreciate is that when we engage with technology, and I just mean that very generally, aside from like the blue light or the physical possible impacts, what we're doing is not a break. It's not turning the system off in a way that is going to create recovery or refueling. We're using our eyes, we're using our ears, we're processing different narratives and stories. We're oftentimes experiencing a range of emotions from laughter to sadness to excitement to suspense. And a lot of times, if you're like me and a lot of other people, you're doing all of that on your phone while there's a movie or show playing on the TV 20 feet away, right?
Yeah.
So the reason you're bringing that, and that's not a judgment, by the way. Like there's a case to be made for indulgences and engaging in certain things that bring pleasure. That's a different conversation. But it is not conservation of energy. It is using energy. It's just using energy that's maybe a little harder to feel or recognize, right? And so, if you're really talking about skills for flourishing and technology, what you want is to develop a skill set and a prevention strategy as well as a reaction strategy so that you're using your energy and technology in values aligned ways, right? And the distinction is that the technology often ends up using us. Again, all the nuances aside, but that's the relationship difference. It's not necessarily, I'm thinking of channel Amy Langston here. It's not necessarily the tech is good or bad. It depends on your relationship with it and how you're using it versus how it might be using you.
Yeah, yeah. As you're talking about scrolling on the phone, I was realizing that oftentimes I'll do that almost as a stress response. Like I'm actually like
Yeah,
seeking to, avoid stress or to decompress,
yeah.
not realizing the consequence. As I thought about, stress response, stress relief in general, and even like the idea of rest more broadly. What are some of the things that just, fundamentals that we're kind of like talking about, looking at, that sort of educators can begin to think about and that students can maybe begin to embrace?
Well, I think that's why energy is a good word because you might distinguish resting from nourishing.
Mm,
Okay, and so like resting, maybe you might say, is really the absence of something that is taxing. Whereas nourishing, or let's say as some shops will call it kind of active recovery, is about like inputting something in that is actually facilitating greater growth, right? Or satisfaction or whatever it is in some way. And I think that's useful because some things that are nourishing are not breaks, right? So we just gave an example. It be nourishing to watch I think, you and I follow some of the same accounts, but watch the funny animal video of like the voiceover of the dog. Like, sure, and I can make a great case for why humor and laughter is a great thing to experience, especially at the end of a long workday, right? As a simple example, that might be nourishing. That ain't a break, right? A break might be taking a walk around the block. It might be the 15, 20-minute power nap. It might be getting in the sauna, the cold tub. It might be, getting to the gym, workout snacks, as we're hearing more and more, just little ways to kind of like, get some energy going and raise the heart rate. Um, a lot of different ways, obviously, you could approach that.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking about another stressor, as you mentioned, the cold tub. Uh, we're seeing, a lot of chronic illness and inflammation in this generation, and I don't know if that shows up in your clients and the way that it's impacting their energy, or if that's something that doesn't really hit your radar. I'd be curious to know, like on the inflammation front, if you guys ever talk about or look at that with your clients.
I certainly do not.
Mhm.
Adam might a little bit more. I'm waiting to see a little bit on some of those things. Like there's a tricky question there, like what's the right amount of energy or inflammation? So like from a coaching perspective, we don't diagnose anyway, right? That's not what
Right.
coaches do. But if you're asking that sort of question, it could be hard to even help a client reflect on what they feel and experience maybe versus what they should. And certainly, we're not in a position necessarily to know whether that might be due to inflammation.
That's really interesting. Um, when you, in general, like if vitality, the conversation broadly, vitality with clients, what other dimensions do you explore? What comes alive for you? Lines of inquiry, exploration.
Yeah, I mean, definitely like I think to your larger question, like where the inflammation question comes from is energy in, energy out, as Adam would say. So like
Mhm.
the nutrition conversation, certainly we're pretty like value or judgment sort of agnostic around, let's say, diet plans. Like, okay, you can make some arguments about a variety of different things in a variety of different ways. But as you and I have talked about, like, if we say energy, are we talking about energy or are we talking about longevity?
Yeah.
Are we talking about how you feel moment to moment, or are we talking about what may or may not impact particular diseases long term? Or if you're a parent, not a parent, what your value set is, like those things to us and the narrative around one's sort of identity, as well as personal physiology, this is where Adam would come in more, should dictate maybe how one relates to what they put in their body, as well as then what they do to sort of exert themselves and get some of the physical benefits of exercise. So that's why we say energy in, energy out, as opposed to like nutrition and exercise. It just frames it from a little bit more of like, how do you want to relate to energy in ways that help you live the sort of life you want to live and the values you want to have?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. To go a totally different direction, and this is an area that, I put on the board even for myself, just provocatively to explore. But, does spiritual formation or practice ever come up in your conversations with clients, or in, I met you actually referred me at one point to Dr. Lisa Miller, I think it was, right?
Yeah.
What have you found in terms of in this domain? Like what's available to us, what's known, what's unknown, what shows up in clients?
Yeah. So I think that because you referenced Lisa, I'll refer to a couple things I think I learned from our conversation with her on Flourish FM. Number one, in terms of like the population we're talking about here, so let's say higher education, Gen Z, let's say 30 or younger, something along those lines, the trend is generally less spirituality. Right. Now that happens to correlate with trends for, lower mental health on average, kind of across the board as well. Right. And we also have plenty of good research, as Lisa lays out in her book, that suggests that a spiritual life and we can talk about what that means, right? Some sort of sense of meaning is generally a good buffer against things like anxiety, suicidality, depression, and let's say sort of like actual diagnosable mental illnesses. So all of that those suggest that the trends are sort of going in the wrong direction, right? And they kind of say, hey, this matters. Like this is a pretty big deal. So then you translate that to, or try to think of it through a lens of like human flourishing. Well, it doesn't really matter what major measure you look at in sort of the well-being space. You could take like PERMA to UPenn. You could take the individual flourishing measure from Harvard. You take SPIRE from Dr. Talben Shahar, one of our board members at TAA. They all include spirituality and or meaning because that's the number two predictor of life satisfaction worldwide, right? It's unavoidable. And to Dr. Miller's points, right? Like it's not just necessarily about life satisfaction, which is the presence of something fulfilling and positive. It also seems to mitigate some of the ill-being that is out there, or at least correlates, right? In some cases with less ill-being, right? And so those aren't necessarily the same thing. Removing something bad versus creating something good, like we want both of those, but they're not necessarily the same experience, right?
Yeah.
So all that to say, this is a huge deal. And how do you go about it? For me, like as an academic, that's where it becomes a little more hand wavy. And listen, you can hear that in our conversation with Lisa. We pressed her on it a little bit as well, right? Like, but here's a simple takeaway that I think is useful for some people, for a lot of people actually. For many people, you can access spirituality through religion. Right. So, it's a minor in, or I had a certification to teach religious studies. I find this fascinating. And so this is an access point for a lot of people because it gives them an operating system. It helps inform values, it helps guide behavior, those sorts of things. And all of those can impact motivation, energy, good health habits, whatever it might be. Right. But what I also want to make very clear is spirituality and religion are not the same thing, and religion and meaning are not the same thing, right? And what you really want is meaning. You want a connection to or a belief in something sort of greater than you that helps guide and keep anchored behaviors, values, sort of, let's say, in some cases, moral philosophies, right? You don't want to just kind of be out there floating in the wind at the beck and call of whatever emotions or neurochemicals come your way necessarily, right?
Yeah.
That has impact on what we talked about last time, coherence and alignment and congruence and those sorts of things, right? So, what does that look like? It might be attending different services and different religious traditions. It might be like volunteering for a cause that feels kind of near and dear to you. It might be doing nonprofit work. It might be just getting involved in local communities. Like there's a lot of different ways, but it is generally going to involve someone or something beyond our own shit.
Yeah. Right. Right. It's really interesting that the generation is sort of displaying sort of a decline in identifying with spirituality. But at the very same time, like McKinsey called this generation the true generation. This generation is more interested than ever in like meaning and mattering and like
Yes.
understanding what's real, right? And so it's
Yes.
really fascinating. And I just really am excited to kind of put this topic on the board and explore it more and go deeper with people like Lisa, hopefully where we can kind of excavate, you know, the impact spirituality has, the potential, like to your point, the practices, like what are the practices? How do we shape meaning in a post-religious world or in a world where religion has taken, a significant back seat in many ways in people's lives. So um
Right.
yeah, another one that's on this board that I'm really interested in too. We have this framing around like healing and holding, and I have found in my own lived life, and I don't know what it animates for you, but there were certain times I went through like very traumatic experiences, and then like unresolved. I found that until that was healed, like I found that my energy was much lower. I felt like I was kind of like moving heavily through life, and I don't know if any of that. Like curious to explore healing and holding from your perspective on you know, our psyches and our how we store stuff in our body and how that shows up in our energy. What comes alive as I'm talking over that? You could say
The
nothing.
first
I have no idea.
well, so not nothing,
Yeah.
actually the other direction. The first thing is like healing and those sorts of things is not my area, and so
Yeah.
I need to be extremely careful there.
Yeah.
What I will share is what experts whose area this is that have come onto our show have told me, right?
Yeah.
And so you mentioned one, does this a quote unquote body keep the score? This is quite controversial out there in the trauma world. We've had Dr. Caroline Leaf and others who have said absolutely 100% it does, right? I think Adam generally subscribes to that. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but certainly you have others who suggest that's not the case. I think there's really interesting work around or in this space from the likes of like Lisa Feldman Barrett and how emotions sort of, they're not just feelings, like they're actually creations of the body. And
Mm.
so like thinking through maybe a less siloed approach here is potentially really useful. How that plays a part in healing is not for me, given my ignorance in that position to say. However, I will say that if to our conversation about energy,
Yeah.
if the body, brain, system, whatever you want, subconscious, whatever you want to call it, if it is holding on to and attempting to process or at least just maintain a grip on some sort of experience or emotion, then it is not using that energy, right, for other things. And so in terms of a blockage, if you will, I don't know that's a blockage, but it seems reasonable to call that a diversion of resources.
Yeah, for sure. And in sort of the framing of energy in, energy out, I have found like even just like rumination on things takes up energy that I don't account for,
Yes.
and various things.
Yes.
And we
It's
see
a
a
good
lot of,
example.
yeah, and we see like a lot of anxiety in this generation, which is not necessarily rumination, but certainly coming from a place of spending energy. And I'm really looking forward to exploring that one. As you look over the list that's in front of us here, I'm curious if anything else comes up for you or anything else we should put on the board for exploration as we go. When you think about energy, when you think about vitality. One thing I should also say is I loved your call out on the integration of like, body and mind and
Mm,
sort of just how those we tend to isolate some things, I think too broadly, right? And not treat it like a whole system. I think that's an
yeah.
interesting one too.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think just like the takeaway for anyone, especially young people, because it's whether you're dealing with the hustle and bustle of just being young and driven and trying to get after it, or there's like a degree of FOMO, if you are not oscillating on and off, so that's cognitively on and off, physically on and off, emotionally in terms of like stress relief you have here on and off, then you're draining, right? You're doing more harm than good over the long term, and over time, that's going to fizzle you out.
Yeah.
Right. So it seems counterintuitive, but the best strategy for long-term energy is to oscillate on and off consistently in the short term. So it's really, really critical to find those 5, 10, 15-minute strategies to shut the system down and let it have this recovery. And we're not saying that just because like, oh, that seems like a cute number. The system works in this way. Like most people have heard of a circadian rhythm, right? A 24-hour biological cycle, but that's made up of a bunch of 60 to 90, maybe 2-hour ultradian cycles,
Mm.
which sort of help facilitate our levels of energy and focus. And so like people can relate to this 60 to 90 minutes of deep work. All of a sudden you notice you're reading an email 3 times, or you're getting up to go get a snack or use the bathroom or whatever. Generally, that's a sign that it's time for a little break. But
Yeah.
but what's the break? Not decompress and grab your phone necessarily. It might be a walk around the block or a little power nap or a little meditation or things like that. Do you still get to get into the phone? Sure, but that's an indulgence, not a break, right? So we need to be clear about what it means to oscillate on and off, and then try to do that consistently.
Awesome. I'm take one of my key takeaways from this conversation, just the framework of energy and energy out. I think we have the opportunity to lift up the things that are taking energy from us, energy out in different capacities, and really elevate practices for energy in ways that I don't know that we're inherently taught. how to gather energy. And you went over a really great list in this, and we can go deeper on it. But um, I know that you have been on back-to-back calls today, so I imagine it's time for you to gather a little energy yourself.
My
And
energy's a little low. Yeah. Yeah.
but I appreciate you taking the time to do this one. And
Of course.
next time we'll hit a topic that I think you enjoy quite a bit, anti-fragility. So,
Yeah.
all right.
Sounds good.
Thank you.